Hi everyone, in this lecture we are going to talk about grid template columns. The grid template columns is a grid container property. So same as with Flexbox, we have some properties which pertain to grid containers, and then we have some other properties which pertain to grid items. First, we are going to cover grid container properties. Grid container properties, same as with Flexbox again, they are declared within the grid within the container declaration block, and the child properties or the item properties, they're declared within specific children upon which we want to apply those actual properties. Now, the grid template columns property of CSS grid layout, it allows us to systematically determine how many columns we want. We are going to be what are going to be the line names among our columns and how responsive the columns should be. Now, this property, it accepts two kinds of values. One is going to be a track size and one is going to be a line name. Now, here is where grid gets a little bit technical, and we are going to cover all of them. So we have track dash size. This is the first kind of value that it accepts, and second value is line name. First, I'm going to show you what line names are. So when I save that and when I go to inspect, let's click on this section container. These arrows and numbers that you see, these basically specify line names. So we have grid column line names, column lines, and we have grid row lines. The lines that indicate grid rows, they're grid row lines. The lines that indicate columns, they're grid column lines. So it's very simple, right? Now, keep in mind that the number of lines is always going to be 1 plus the number of rows or columns. So you can see here at the bottom right corner of our window, if I can zoom in, and it went away. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit back to 100%. We have only one column here, but the ending line number says 2. So the ending line number is always number of columns plus 1. And here we have 20 columns, but the ending 20 rows, but the ending line number for rows, it says 21. Now, this is a grid container has been initiated, and all of the immediate children are grid items. Now, that was the line name. What is track size? So any number of grids that you have in any specific direction, that is going to be a track. And the size of that entire grid within that, for that direction, that is going to specify the track size. Now, this was a little bit confusing, so let's just dive into code. Now, I want to say right this up front that we are going to create our websites using grid, and it is imperative that you understand these concepts right from the start. Now, deciding the number of columns that you want for your website is going to directly decide whether or not your website is going to be responsive, whether or not it's going to look good on all devices. So that's something that you should really think about. And you should really think about, okay, how many sections do I want in this website? How many columns I want? I mean, when it comes to creating rows, we know that grid is two-dimensional, so we will be creating rows and columns. Now, for rows, you don't have to really overthink, because one of the advice is the advice that I would give you for making responsive websites is never determine the height of your content. Let the content decide its height. In that case, you're going to end up with a fluid system. If you fix the height of your content, it's going to be fixed, and for every 100 pixels that you go either up or down, you need to provide media queries, and at the end of the day, it's going to become a nightmare to maintain and scale. So never decide the height of your content. I mean, you know how much content you want, but you cannot decide whether when that content reduces from 1000 pixels to 300 pixels, how much height the content will require. There is no way for you to really pinpoint the actual value. So what if the content doesn't have a predefined height? The height of the content specifies the height of the rows. we are talking about template columns, right? That is just something that I'm preparing you for. So the most important thing that you need to keep in mind is, let's get back to our discussion. The most important thing that you need to keep in mind is that when it comes to grid, first and foremost, you need to think about columns. There are a lot of different combinations of units that you can use for columns. There are specific grid units that you can only use for grid that have been created specifically for grid, which is one FR unit, fractional unit. We're going to cover all of them. That's why there are a lot of lectures with a lot of explanation, because if you get this grid system right, you will be able to create 5 websites per day. That is my guarantee. And that is a very, very good skill that you're going to have. And that skill is going to land you jobs. That skill is going to get you your freelancing projects. So let's talk about grid template columns. I have a lot to talk about when it comes to grid. I'm really excited that we have come this far and we have started talking about grid. I am in love with CSS Grid. It's so good. It's a really, really advanced feature of CSS, at the same time very simple, but yet very versatile and capable. So this is Grid template columns. The idea behind this is to create columns. Now, how do you specify how many columns you want? Now, the number of units that you provide here, that they are going to specify the number of columns you're going to end up with. So if I say 150 pixels, this is going to give me 1 column. If I say another 150 pixels, this is going to, how many units are there? There are 2 units, 2 value units. So this is going to give me 2 columns. I'm going to say another 150. This is going to give me 3 columns. Another 150 pixels. This is going to give me 4 columns whose width is 150 pixels. And if I save that, congratulations, you just created your very first set of columns. Now, it is item 1 all the way to item 20. So it's sensible that when you have 20 items and 4 columns, you will end up with 5 perfect rows. So this is the first set of values that you could use. Let's go ahead and let's add another column, one more column. So how would you be able to add a column? Just add another value unit. And I'm going to make this a little bit smaller and make this bigger. There we go. So now we have 5 columns, 1, 2, all the way to 5, and 4 rows. Now, writing all of these is a little bit repetitive and it takes a little bit more time. There is a function in CSS Grid, and that is the repeat function. In case you want to create the same with columns and you want to create like 5 of them or 10 of them, you can use this function. So I'm going to say grid template columns. So repeat. Now, this repeat only works if the width or the size of all of your columns are the same. Keep that in mind. Now, let's say I want to create 10 columns. So the first value is going to be the number of columns. The second value is going to define the dimension for those columns. I want to have 10 columns whose width is going to be 100 pixels. Now you're going to end up with 10 columns. There we go. So you have 10 columns, 100 pixels with each. Let's move forward. Let's do another example for grid template columns. I'm going to say repeat. How many columns? I want to have 7 columns, and I want to have them at 150 pixels width, all of them. So it's going to create a consistent layout. Now, let's move into responsive menu. And I'm going to go full screen, and I'm going to make this big. There we go. Now you can see that this system is not responsive. It's not fluid at all. There is another unit that I'm going to introduce you to, and that is the FR unit, the fractional unit. Now, a fractional unit, it works almost in the same way as flex grow works. It provides the available space to that element or to that grid item that you want it to be dedicated to. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to say grid template columns repeat. Let's say I want to have 4 columns, but I want these 4 columns to occupy the entire grid space. So how would you grow them? You're going to use 1FR. This is a unit that is only usable within grid. This is a unit tailored for CSS grid. And there we go. So now you see we have 4 columns, and all of them are basically, they're spanning across the entire grid. And we can check that. Now you can see this is a little bit more fluid. It's increasing and decreasing in width, and we are not ending up with a horizontal scroll bar. Now, 1FR means one part or portion of the available space. Now, what is available space? The available space is basically the area of the grid container. Now, how would you calculate 1FR? It's really difficult. It's a highly, highly dynamic value. It depends on so many things, and still you cannot calculate it. You can visualize it, but you can never pinpoint what the value of 1FR is. It's even more flexible than a percentage, than a viewport height. It's even more flexible than that. So what you can do is, one way, that is just a trick, and you have to calculate how many FRs you have within your grid template columns. So if you have 4 FRs, and let's say the width of your grid container is 1000, 4 FRs, if there is no other column with any other fixed unit. So what is the available space in your grid? So the available space is 1000 pixels in width. So, and there is no other fixed column, like a column fixed width of 150 pixels. And your job is to create 10 columns. All of them have to be dynamic, and they should take equal sizes. Now, you can say repeat 10 1FR. In that case, 1FR is going to refer to 10% of the container, which is 100 pixels. But if the container is 1500 and you want to create 10 columns, in that case, 1FR is going to refer to, if there is no other fixed column width value, then 1FR is going to refer to, it's going to still be 10%, but the actual pixel value is going to be 150. So this is what I meant by this being a highly relative unit. We could also dedicate more width to some columns and less width to other columns using FR. So we have 1FR for the first column, 2FR for the second column, 3FR for the third column, and 4FR for the fourth column. Now, how much 1FR is going to refer to? First, calculate all of the FRs. So 4 plus 3, that is 7, plus 3, that is 10. So in the entire Flex grid container, it has 10 FRs. 1% of it, or 10% of it, is going to be occupied by the first, 20, and then 30, and then 40. This is how it is going to be dedicated. Now you can see 10, 20% of the container, 30, and then 40%. And it is going to be adjusted accordingly. Now I'm just going to give you one more example. This has become a very long lecture, and we are going to call it a lecture. And that is, when can you use line names? How to write line names. Now we are not going to use line names just yet. I have dedicated separate lectures for those, and you need to be patient. Now, when you say line names and you change these line names will not be changed. It's just that you can leverage those customized line names that you create to your advantage. You can use them, you can leverage them, and I'm going to show you how you can do that as well in our upcoming lectures. Don't worry, we have a lot of them. So we have grid template columns. Now, if you want to provide the line name for the first column, you can provide only one line name, but as with the grid that we have, each column is going to have a starting point and an ending point. Therefore, a starting line, and an ending line. Therefore, for each column, you can provide a starting line name and an ending line name. That's the common convention, at least. So you are going to use bracket notation, and I'm going to say line -1 -start, and let's say this is 150 pixels. I'm going to keep going. I'm just going to copy this. You know what? It's going to take so long for me to type these. So let's just copy that and put it here. So the first one was, let's go full screen. It was line 1 start. The second one is going to be line 1 end. And I'm going to copy the entire thing. And this is just for one column. Maybe you want to have 2 columns, 3 columns, and 4 columns. So this is line 2 start, line 2 end, line 3 start, line 3 end, and line 4 start, line 4 end. Now, usually when it comes to grid, you can specify as many columns as you want. Usually you can specify 8 columns, 12 columns, 16 columns, 24 columns. I get this question a lot, how do I know how many columns I need? It depends on what kind of website you use, you want to create, and what do you really feel comfortable with. So if you feel comfortable with managing 8 columns, just go ahead and create 8 columns. That website is going to become responsive. If you are more interested in more columns and more control, you could create 16 columns. But let me tell you this, that a 16 column layout is no more responsive than an 8 column layout if you know what you're doing. So if you're a beginner, it's recommended to create as a few columns as you want. Fewer number of columns is recommended. As you progress and you create higher level websites that have a lot of moving parts, like sidebars and some comment section from the Twitter, all that good stuff, then you will be needing more grid columns. But for now, the more columns you have, the advantage is the more control you're going to have over your layout. But the downside is that you will need to have to think and keep in mind more number of columns, like a lot more, like 18 to 16. That's twice as many columns that you need to have control over. And I don't mean like any kind of control. I mean like 100% control. So think of this before actually coming up with how many columns you need. Now that's it for this lecture. See you in the next one.